Hello, everybody. My name is Richard Clark, and I'm an addictions therapist, counselor living in the lower mainland of British Columbia. Um, as a result of a request from Terry Wood, who is the education coordinator at the Easy Does It Club in Surrey, um, he asked if I would put together a series of short videos that would address the nature of addiction, the psychology of the steps, and basically what's wrong with addiction treatment and how we can fix it. Because, as most of us know, we're running at about a 90 or 95% failure rate when addicts and alcoholics, or addicts of any description, sex addicts, gamblers, addicts, when they leave treatment, they usually relapse within a few days or a few weeks, 90 to 95% of the time. And this is a shocking statistic that very few people want to talk about. When treatment centers that are run by highly paid professionals, when treatment centers charge anywhere from $25,000 or $30,000 a month to upwards of $80,000 or $90,000 a month, depending on how special or sophisticated the level of treatment is, at $30,000 a month to have a 90 or 95% guaranteed failure rate is shocking. And as I'll explain in a few minutes, that high failure rate cannot continuously be blamed on the addicts or the alcoholics that are seeking recovery. The purpose of the videos, in discussion with Terry Wood, the purpose of the videos is to understand a little bit of the history of alcoholism and addiction in North America for the last 180 years or so, to understand the psychology of addiction recovery and what's required. What was presented to us through Alcoholics Anonymous, created by Bill Wilson and Bob Smith. Alcoholics Anonymous is considered the grandfather of all 12-step recovery programs. What they presented in 1939 in their book was what we commonly understand today as a faith-based treatment. And it's partly because of that, and partly because of religious and social and political persecution of addicts and alcoholics, that we don't understand and nobody's really talked about. It's because of faith-based treatment and the misunderstanding about the persecution of society and religions and politicians against alcoholics and addicts that we have this failure rate. And my conversations with Terry, what prompted him to ask me to do this lecture series was that he had read and saw a lot of value in the two books that I've published about the modern interpretations of addiction. And these are behind me here on my left. The green one is called Spiritual Transformation, and it is now the third edition. And it's a very complicated and in-depth look at addiction, family systems theory, shame-based identities, a very careful analysis of the steps from a spiritual point of view. And that's independent of whether or not you believe in God or a higher power, or whether or not you're an agnostic atheist. It's the third edition. It's quite detailed. It's about 600 pages. And it was published in 2017. And the blue book is called The Addiction Recovery Handbook, and it's the revised second edition of the next book that I wrote and published about addiction. And it goes into great depth about the cultural importance of the persecution of addicts, the religious bias in treatment of addicts, which is also in itself a method of persecution, and sort of the ignorance and poor response that we received from politicians in trying to address what I consider to be a monumental crisis in North America. So these two books, which Terry and I have, well, Terry read them, and which we've discussed at some length. Terry found a lot of value in them for people who are trying to understand addiction and recovery. These are available through two websites. The first one is the publisher's website, which is friesenpress.com in Victoria, BC. Friesen Press, and they are both available on Amazon.ca and Amazon.com. if you would like to get in touch with myself or Terry Wood, here are two websites. The first one is www.easydoesitclub.org, and through them you can get in touch with Terry Wood if you're interested in any programs or understanding the Easy Does It Club. And the bottom one is how you get in touch with me. My counseling website is www.greenroomlectures.ca. So either one of those will put you in touch with us, and if you find value in this sort of overview of addictions that I'm presenting in the seminar series and you want to learn more about it, then I would encourage you to get both of these books and to read them. They're a slow read. There's a lot of detailed analysis in them. There's a lot of learning. Because I personally think that one of the problems we're having in trying to deal with the addiction crisis in North America, and that's all manner of addictions, relationship addiction, sex addiction, shopping and spending addictions, addiction to sports, addiction to celebrities and celebrity worship, alcohol, drugs, addiction to bankruptcy, aggression, religious addiction, especially in the self-righteousness that's involved in religious addiction. All of these addictions can only be addressed by a much deeper level of understanding the psychology of addiction and what the psychology of the sort of original AA 12 steps really means. So, what I encourage you to remember or understand, and it's quite a bit actually, is that while you're listening to this and while you're going through this, remember that since 1939, we have commonly accepted and bought into the theory that was presented by Bill Wilson in his book Alcoholics Anonymous. We've bought into the theory that addiction recovery, or the 12-step program, must include some variation of believing in God, coming to believe in God, understanding some kind of a higher power of your own understanding, and praying and participating in a relationship with this higher power, praying, hoping that the higher power will offer some benevolence to you in helping you address the problems that you're facing in your life. And there's what I think is a crippling presentation of this concept of forgiveness, that you must seek forgiveness from your higher power, that you must forgive yourself for the moral turpitude of having an addiction, which is, in Protestant evangelical terms, sinning, and seeking forgiveness from the people that you have hurt, or at least understanding that that forgiveness is a concept that's a part of the process. And on careful examination, this stands very much in contradiction to the idea of disease or illness that was presented to us by the American Medical Association in 1987. The two are mutually exclusive. If this is an illness, forgiveness is unnecessary. And if there's moral turpitude or sinning, then forgiveness must be sought through some version of higher power. Now, within all of this, there's several other things that have to be understood. The first one is that faith-based treatment, which I'll be referring to a few times, faith-based treatment is understanding the traditional approach of Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and other 12-step programs. That somehow the addict seeking recovery has to come to terms with believing in God, trusting this higher power, finding your own understanding or your own perception of God, seeking forgiveness for some version of moral turpitude. And that's sort of the standard approach that's been around since Alcoholics Anonymous began. Now, what we've come to in the last 10 years is to understand that across North America, Canada, and the United States, there is somewhere around 14 or 15,000 recovery centers and treatment centers all across North America. And that's recovery houses, short-term, recovery houses, long-term, and various levels of treatment for various kinds of addictions. There's about 14 or 15,000 treatment centers. And the majority of these treatment centers approach recovery through some variation of the scheme that was presented by Bill Wilson and Bob Smith in 1939, that there has to be some kind of faith and God and forgiveness involved in the process. There was a reason for that. So these 14 or 15,000 treatment centers discharge into our communities every month somewhere between 450 and 500,000 newcomers to the recovery game. And so every month, 450,000 newcomers, raw, anxious, confused, misunderstanding the illness concept of addiction, maybe disagreeing with the whole idea of God and forgiveness. About 450,000 people are discharged from treatment and pushed into support groups and recovery programs, or even longer term residential facilities. And that doesn't take into account that in the recent census data we've got in Canada and the United States is that in the early 1960s and the late 1950s, census data indicated that about 5% of the population in Canada and about 4% or 3% of the population in the United States openly declared that they were atheist or agnostic. And in 2010, about 50 years later, 2015, 55 years later, the census information from Canada indicates that about 33% of the population are openly declared atheist or agnostic. And in the confidentiality of census information, about 27 or 28% of the population of the United States declares that they're atheist or agnostic. And that's a tremendous shift in culture in 50 years, especially since we understand that the population of North America has gone from somewhere around 225 million in the 1960s to somewhere over 375 million in 2020. That's a tremendous shift in the percentage of people who declare themselves agnostic or atheist, which is important when it comes to addiction treatment. The other thing that's interesting that people in recovery and traditional 12-step programs don't want to talk about is the best information that I can find is that sometime in the last 10 or 15 years, there has been about 400,000 people who have left Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous and the traditional way that they present faith-based treatment. So the two most popular 12-step programs have lost about 400,000 people who have joined the various programs and then quit and left. And this, of course, brings up some curiosity and questions and consternation about where did these 400,000 people go and why did they quit? Well, what they don't want to talk about and fail to address is at the same time, and approximately over the same period of time, since, I don't know, about 2010 or so, is that the proliferation of agnostic and atheist 12-step meetings has increased drastically. And at present, across North America, it is estimated that there's somewhere between 350 and 400,000 men and women who are participating in agnostic or atheist 12-step recovery programs. This is where they have rewritten the 12 steps. They've erased or eliminated all reference to God and prayer and spirit and God beliefs, and approach the program from a responsible psychological perspective. So their membership is now at 350 or 400,000. And so that leads me to believe that it's a coincidence, and I don't think it's a coincidence, but it's coincidental that as the traditional AA and NA groups have dropped about 400,000 people, the participation in agnostic and atheist groups have gone up 350 or 400,000 to 350 or 400,000. That's a significant statistic. So what I want to cover in the video series, and I expect there'll be maybe 15 or 16 videos of about 20 minutes each. The first few videos will be about the history of alcoholism or drug addiction in North America, the birth and the development of Alcoholics Anonymous and similar 12-step programs that are faith-based. And that will take us up to about 1939, 1940. And then there'll be a couple of other videos on what's happened in society since about 1940 or 1945 and what brings us to the chaos that we have in addiction and addiction treatment today. And this may sound confusing because as I explain these first few videos about the history of addiction and our points of view about what addiction is, I'll define addiction, I'll talk about the different types of addiction, the symptoms of addiction. As I explain this, it's going to probably sound confusing. I'll explain some aspect of history through to about 1920, then I'm going to have to back up and start over again talking about something else. And I'll get to 1920 or 1930, and then I'm going to have to back up and start all over again. That's because of the nature of the crisis that we embraced in the 1920s and 30s. There were 3 or 4 significant factors that contributed to this major alcoholism, drug addiction crisis that we faced in the 1920s and 1930s. And that has to be understood because what we carry with us today, 100 years after that, in 2020 and onward, is we carry a lot of history about inculcated shame and guilt from the repressive and draconian points of view of religions and politicians and society and the way that they've distanced themselves and persecuted addicts and alcoholics. So that's the first 4 or 5 videos. Then I'll spend probably one video on each of the steps explaining the psychology of it, how it relates to spiritual principles. I'll be spending some time explaining to you what spiritual principles are. And hopefully, if you're interested in the information, then you'll explore it with people in your group. You'll talk about these new alternatives to treatment. You might get a copy of these 2 books and start discussion groups on them, because I think the key to reducing the addictions crisis that we face today is in social education, in understanding what's been going on for the last 180 years. So that's a sort of an overview of what we're up against. The next video, I will start talking about the temperance movement in 1840. I'll be talking about the opium crisis in the United States, and I'll be talking a lot about the suffragette movement and the politics of prohibition and what happened in the Jazz Age, and that will take us up to Bill Wilson in 1939. So thank you for listening thus far, and I'll get on with video 2 in a few minutes.